Tonight we travel back tens of thousands of years, back to a quieter world, a slower world, a world where the sky was wider and the land was emptier and the nights were very, very still. Imagine a valley long and wide, carved gently by the movement of ancient ice. The edges of that valley rise into soft hills, and at the base of one of those hills there is a cave, just an opening in the stone, dark inside but not frightening, sheltered, protected, peaceful. From inside that cave, a small fire burns. It burns low and steady, casting a warm orange glow against the curved stone walls. The smoke rises slowly, drifting upward toward a natural crack in the ceiling, disappearing into the cool night air above. And around that fire there are people, not many, perhaps a dozen, perhaps a few more. They are sitting quietly, leaning against the stone, wrapped in soft animal skins. Some are sleeping already, some are watching the fire. One or two are speaking softly to each other, their voices low and unhurried. Outside, the wind moves across the valley. It is a cold wind, gentle but persistent, the kind of wind that has been blowing across this land for thousands of years and will continue blowing long after this particular night is over. The stars above the valley entrance are very bright. There are no other lights anywhere. Just the stars and the faint orange glow from inside the cave, and the slow, quiet breathing of a small group of people settling into their night. This is where we begin. This is the story of how humans lived inside caves, not a story of struggle or hardship, though those things existed, not a story of danger, though the world outside was wild and cold. This is a story of shelter, of warmth, of small daily rituals that kept people together across thousands of years. Of the simple, enduring beauty of a fire burning in the dark. Let yourself settle as we begin. Take a slow breath. Let your thoughts grow quiet. We are going a long way back tonight, and there is no hurry at all. The world outside the cave before we step inside, let us pause for a moment at the entrance. Let us look outward, across the valley, and try to understand the world these early humans lived within. The time we are visiting is deep in the Paleolithic era. The word Paleolithic simply means the Old Stone Age, and it stretches across an enormous span of time, from roughly 3 million years ago, when the earliest stone tools first appeared, all the way to about 12,000 years ago, when the last great ice sheets began to slowly melt, and the world began to change into something more familiar to us. For much of this long period, the climate of the Earth was cooler than it is today. Not always frozen, not always harsh, but cooler and more varied in ways that shaped the landscape profoundly. During the coldest phases, known as glacial periods or ice ages, vast sheets of ice covered large portions of the northern continents. These ice sheets could be kilometers thick in places, heavy and slow and ancient. They advanced over thousands of years and retreated over thousands more, and the land they left behind was carved and smoothed and reshaped by their passage. But here, in this valley, the ice is not close. The valley lies at a latitude that has escaped the thickest of the glaciers, though the air is still cold and the winters are long. The landscape around this cave is a kind of open grassland, dotted with sparse trees along the riverbanks and more dense forest on the slopes of the higher hills to the east. This type of environment is sometimes called a cold steppe or a mammoth steppe, because the large grazing animals that live here include woolly mammoths, moving slowly in small herds across the flat ground, and woolly rhinoceroses, solid and quiet along the tree lines, and horses and bison and reindeer, all of them adapted to the cold in ways that make them thick and heavy and patient. The river at the bottom of the valley is narrow this time of year, its edges iced over in the early mornings, though the central current keeps moving, dark and quiet under a pale sky. In summer, this river runs fuller and faster. In deep winter, it may freeze almost completely. But now, in these in-between weeks of autumn, it moves at a steady, peaceful pace, and the animals come to drink at its banks in the early morning light. Standing at the cave entrance and looking out across all of this, you would feel the cold immediately. Not a biting, dangerous cold, but a clean, clear cold that settles into the air and makes everything very still and very sharp. The grass is dry. The light is low and golden, coming from a sun that sits close to the horizon even in the middle of the day. The sky is enormous. There are no sounds of human industry, no distant engines, no hum of cities. There is the wind. There is the occasional movement of birds. There is the far-off sound of the river. And there is the cave, behind you, warm and sheltering, with its small fire and its sleeping people, and its familiar smell of smoke and earth and animal skin. This was the world these early humans inhabited, and the cave, in all of this openness and cold, was the still center of their daily life. It is worth pausing here to think about what the climate actually meant for these people, because understanding the environment helps us understand every choice they made, every habit they developed, every small ritual of their daily existence. The cold was not simply an inconvenience. It was a fundamental organizing principle of their lives. It determined when and where they could travel. It shaped the distribution of the animals they depended on. It influenced how they built their fires, how they stored their food, how they clothed themselves, how they slept. And yet the cold was also, in its own way, a kind of gift. Cold temperatures slowed the decay of organic material, which meant that food could be kept longer. Cold air preserved the quality of animal hides, making them easier to work with over time. Cold winters pushed large herds of animals into more predictable migration patterns, which meant that hunters who understood those patterns could anticipate where the animals would be. In this sense, the cold was not an enemy. It was simply a condition of life, as neutral and constant as the stone walls of the cave itself. The sun in this world rose late and set early during the winter months. The daylight hours were precious, used fully for gathering, hunting, tool-making, and the 100 small practical tasks of daily life. When the light faded, and it faded quickly in the deep of winter, the world outside the cave became very dark very fast. Not the partial darkness of a modern night, softened by distant lights and reflected glow. Real darkness. The kind of darkness that makes the fire inside the cave not merely a source of warmth, but a source of orientation, of safety, of meaning. The stars on clear nights were extraordinary. Without any competing light, the night sky above this valley would have been densely, brilliantly populated with stars, far more than any of us typically see today. The Milky Way would have been clearly visible as a wide band of soft light arching overhead. The planets would have shone steadily and brightly. The moon, when it was present, would have been the dominant light source of the night, strong enough to cast shadows, strong enough to navigate by, strong enough to create a dim, silvery version of the daytime world. These early humans knew the sky intimately. They had no choice. The sky was their calendar, their clock, their compass. They watched the position of the stars to understand the turning of the seasons. They tracked the phases of the moon to mark the passage of time. They observed the changing angle of the sun across the valley to know when the longest and shortest days were approaching. All of this knowledge was not written down. It was held in memory, passed from the older people to the younger, spoken aloud around fires in the evenings, embedded in the rhythms of daily life. But let us not rush ahead too far. Let us return to the valley, to the cool morning air, to the cave at the base of the hill. Let us begin to understand why these people chose this particular cave and what it meant to them to live within it. Why humans chose caves. Not every cave was suitable for habitation. The relationship between early humans and the caves they used was not a simple one of finding any available shelter and moving in. Over many generations, people developed a careful and refined understanding of what made a good cave, and they returned again and again to the caves that met their needs, sometimes across thousands of years of continuous or seasonal use. The first consideration was the entrance. A good cave entrance faced away from the prevailing cold winds. In many parts of Europe, where some of the most thoroughly studied cave sites are found, this meant an entrance that faced roughly south or southeast, oriented toward whatever warmth the winter sun could offer. An entrance that faced north or northeast would funnel the cold wind directly into the living space, making the interior difficult to heat and uncomfortable to inhabit. An entrance that faced south allowed the low winter sun to reach into the cave during the middle of the day, warming the stone floor and the air just inside. And when the opening was not too large, this solar warmth could persist for several hours into the afternoon. The size of the entrance also mattered. Too large, and the wind and cold came straight through, making the fire work harder and the people colder. Too small, and the smoke from the fire had nowhere to go, filling the interior with a heavy, choking haze that stung the eyes and made breathing unpleasant. The ideal entrance was moderate in size, large enough to allow the smoke to drift outward naturally, but not so large that the interior was exposed fully to the elements. Some caves had entrance areas that were more open, functioning almost as sheltered porches, with the main living space set back a few meters from the opening where the stone overhead provided solid protection. The interior of the cave itself needed to be relatively dry. This was not always easy to achieve because stone absorbs and holds moisture, and many caves are formed by the action of water moving through rock over very long periods of time. A cave that had active water running through it, or that had a floor that collected standing water during rainy periods, was not a good home. But a cave that sat above the water table, with a floor of dry packed earth or smooth stone, and walls that were merely cool and slightly damp rather than wet and dripping, could be made quite comfortable with the addition of animal skins and a well-managed fire. The depth of the cave also played a role. A shallow cave, really just a rock overhang or a shallow alcove, offered limited protection. It might shelter from rain, but it could not hold warmth effectively, and it offered little sense of enclosure, of being truly inside something solid and protective. A very deep cave, on the other hand, could become confusing and difficult to navigate, and the deepest sections were often too far from any natural light to be practical for daily living. The ideal habitation zone was typically within the first 20 or 30 meters of the cave entrance, close enough to the outside to receive some natural light and fresh air, but deep enough to be genuinely sheltered. The floor of the cave was important too. Early humans did not simply spread their skins on bare stone and leave it at that. Over time, the floor of a regularly inhabited cave became modified in ways both intentional and accidental. Layers of ash from the fire accumulated. Fragments of worked stone from tool making built up in certain areas. Organic material, plant matter, animal bones, discarded food remnants, all of this settled into the floor and was pressed down and compacted over time. Archaeologists, when they excavate the floors of ancient cave sites today, find these layers like the pages of a very slow and patient book, each layer representing a period of habitation, all of them stacked gently on top of one another across centuries and millennia. The cave was also chosen for its relationship to the surrounding landscape. A cave that sat at the edge of a good hunting ground, near a reliable water source, within reasonable distance of the kinds of plants and animals that provided food and materials, was infinitely more valuable than a cave in a more remote or resource-poor location. The people who used these caves were not simply looking for a roof over their heads. They were embedding themselves in a particular territory, developing a relationship with a specific piece of land that they would return to across many seasons, many years, perhaps many generations. And there was something else, something perhaps harder to articulate in purely practical terms. A good cave felt safe, not just physically safe, but psychologically safe. The solid stone above and around you, the way the walls curved close and familiar. The way the fire's warmth filled the interior and turned the cave into a pocket of heat and light against the dark and cold outside. These early people, like all people, needed not just physical shelter, but the felt experience of being protected. The cave provided that. It was not merely a building material, not merely a structure of convenient rock. It was a home. It carried memory and familiarity. It smelled of their fires and their presence. And returning to it, after a day of travel and work in the open world, must have felt something like what we mean when we use the word relief. Let us think for a moment about the different peoples who lived in these caves, because the story of cave habitations spans not just one kind of human, but several. The Neanderthals were one of the most significant of these. They lived in Europe and Western Asia from roughly 400,000 years ago until about 40,000 years ago, and they were cave dwellers in a very real and deliberate sense. They were not primitive or simple beings. They had large brains, comparable in size to our own. They made and used stone tools of considerable sophistication. They cared for their sick and elderly. They buried their dead in some cases, which suggests a relationship with the concept of death that goes beyond mere biological instinct. They used fire consistently and skillfully, and they lived in caves, returning to favored sites repeatedly, managing the interior space, maintaining their hearths, organizing their activities within the sheltered space the cave provided. Then, beginning roughly 45,000 years ago, anatomically modern humans, people whose skeletons are essentially indistinguishable from our own, arrived in Europe, having spread from Africa over tens of thousands of years of slow migration across the ancient world. These early Homo sapiens also used caves. They brought with them an extraordinary flowering of symbolic thought and artistic expression, which we can see most vividly in the cave paintings they left behind, but which extended into every dimension of their lives. They made ornaments of shell and bone and ivory. They created figurines. They marked and decorated objects in ways that suggest a rich inner life, a world of story and symbol and meaning that went far beyond the immediate practical needs of survival. For a period of time, perhaps 10,000 years or more, Neanderthals and early modern humans coexisted in parts of Europe and the Near East. They may have traded or exchanged ideas or encountered each other in valleys and at river crossings. And we know now from genetic analysis that they interbred to some extent. Most people alive today carry a small percentage of Neanderthal DNA, a quiet inheritance from those long ago encounters in a world of cold grass and stone. Eventually, the Neanderthals disappeared, replaced by or absorbed into the expanding modern human populations. The reasons for this transition are still a matter of careful study and gentle debate among researchers. It was not a sudden event. It unfolded slowly over thousands of years in the quiet way that most of the important changes of the deep past unfolded. But the caves remained. The caves held the memory of all of them in the ash layers of their hearths, in the stone tools they left behind, in the bones of the animals they ate, in the images they painted on the walls. Entering the cave at night, let us now follow a small group of people as the day draws to a close and they make their way back toward the cave. The afternoon has been long and productive. A few of the adults have been ranging across the valley and along the river, observing the movement of the reindeer herd that passed through the area several days ago. Others have spent the day near the cave itself, working on stone tools, collecting dry grass and bark from the tree line below, preparing materials for the coming days. Two of the older women have been processing an animal skin that was brought in earlier in the week, working it with smooth stones and careful hands to soften it and make it pliable, a task that requires hours of patient, repetitive effort. Now the light is fading. The sun has dropped below the western hills, and the sky above the valley has moved through shades of gold and pale orange into a deepening blue. The cold is intensifying as it always does at this hour, settling more firmly into the air, making every breath a small, visible cloud. The people moving across the valley floor toward the cave are walking at a steady, unhurried pace. They are not running. They are not afraid. They know this land well, every dip and rise of it, every familiar tree and stone. They have walked this route so many times that their feet find it almost without conscious direction. As they approach the cave, they can smell it before they can clearly see the entrance in the fading light. The smell of smoke is there, faint and pleasant, the particular smell of a fire that has been banked low and is breathing quietly rather than burning brightly. And within that smell, the deeper smell of the cave itself, cool stone and old ash and animal skin, and the specific organic scent of a place that has been lived in for a long time. It is a familiar smell. It is a home smell. And for those who have been out in the open air all day, it is a welcoming smell. They pass through the entrance. The temperature inside the cave is noticeably warmer than the air outside. Not dramatically warm, not as warm as a modern heated room, but several degrees warmer, enough to feel immediately as you step inside. The stone walls hold whatever heat has been generated during the day, releasing it slowly as the night comes on. The floor near the fire is the warmest place, of course, and the people who have been inside all day have already positioned themselves there, sitting or lying on layered skins close to the embers. One of the returning adults moves to the fire and crouches beside it, adding several pieces of carefully selected wood. The fire accepts the new fuel slowly, sending up a curl of pale smoke, then beginning to build again, the orange glow strengthening, the light inside the cave expanding. Shadows shift on the walls. The ceiling, curved and smoke-darkened, catches the new light and seems to come closer, lower, more intimate. People settle. There is quiet conversation. A child moves from one adult to another, then finds a comfortable position against a woman's side and stays there. An older man picks up a piece of flint from near his feet and turns it in his hands, examining it in the firelight, planning what he will do with it tomorrow. Someone coughs softly. Someone sighs. The fire crackles gently and steadily, a sound so familiar and constant that it sits at the very edge of conscious awareness, more felt than heard. Outside, the night is deepening. The wind across the valley entrance carries a whisper of cold air into the mouth of the cave, but only a whisper, only the very outermost edge of the night's chill. Inside, around the fire, the air is warm enough to be comfortable, with the skins wrapped close. The stars are becoming visible now through the cave entrance, very bright against the darkening sky. This is the evening transition, the passage from the active outside world to the still, warm interior world of the cave. It happens every day. It has been happening every day for as long as these people can remember, as long as their parents remembered, as long as anyone has kept count of days. It is one of the most fundamental rhythms of their life, as natural and inevitable as the turning of the seasons or the cycle of sleep and waking. And there is something deeply restful about this transition. The outside world, with all its demands, its observations, its decisions, its physical work, is left at the cave entrance. Inside, the world simplifies. It becomes the fire and the warmth and the familiar faces of the people you have lived alongside for your entire life. Fire and warmth, the fire at the center of the cave's habitation space, was not a simple or accidental thing. It was carefully made, carefully maintained, and deeply important in ways that extended far beyond the obvious functions of warmth and light. Making fire was a skill, and like all skills, it required knowledge and practice. Early Paleolithic humans had two primary methods available to them. The first was percussion, striking a piece of flint or another hard stone against iron pyrite or a similar mineral to create sparks, then catching those sparks in a carefully prepared nest of dry tinder. The second was friction, using a wooden hand drill or bow drill to generate heat through rapid rotation against a softwood fire board. Both methods required specific materials, dry and well prepared, and both required practiced technique. A fire made with a bow drill, for instance, requires not just the right wood combination, but a very specific and consistent pressure and speed of movement to generate enough heat to produce an ember. Too slow and nothing happens. Too fast and the drill jumps from the groove. The right rhythm held steadily and patiently produces first a thin curl of smoke, then a small glowing coal. Then, if you transfer that coal carefully to your tinder nest and blow on it with slow, steady breaths, a flame. The moment of successful fire making was never quite routine. Even for experienced adults, there was always a small element of uncertainty, a dependence on conditions of dampness and temperature and the quality of the materials that made every successful fire a small achievement worth noting. Children watching adults make fire saw something that combined practical skill with something almost mysterious, the production of light and warmth from apparently inert material, the bringing into being of something that had not existed a moment before. Once established, the hearth fire was treated with care. It was not allowed to go out if it could be helped. Someone always had a sense of the fire's condition, even when not directly tending it. The way it burned told information. A fire burning bright and hot, with steady flames, meant good dry fuel and adequate air. A fire burning low and smoking heavily meant damp wood, or too much ash build up, or not enough ventilation. A fire that had burned down to coals was in a transitional state, still very hot in the center, capable of being rebuilt quickly with fresh fuel, but needing attention before it grew any cooler. Carrying fire was possible. A piece of slow-burning fungus or a bundle of dry bark could hold an ember for hours if protected from wind and managed carefully. This was important for groups that traveled seasonally between different locations. Rather than relying on the ability to make fire from scratch every evening, which depended on weather conditions and material availability, They could carry a continuously burning ember from one campsite to the next, feeding it carefully during the journey, bringing it to a new hearth location, and building up a full fire from it upon arrival. The warmth of the fire was distributed unevenly through the cave's interior, and people arranged themselves in relation to this gradient with a practical intuition developed over lifetimes. The oldest and youngest members, most vulnerable to the cold, sat or slept closest to the fire. The healthy adults at the height of their physical capability could manage a position slightly further back, where the warmth was less intense but still sufficient. The space nearest the cave entrance, where the cold air was most present, was not a sleeping space at all. It was a threshold, a transitional zone where the inside and outside worlds met. The fire also served as a focal point for social life. In any group of people living closely together, there is always a need for a common center, a place where people naturally gather, where the group coheres and the bonds between individuals are maintained and reinforced. In the cave, the fire was that center. It was where people sat together in the evenings. It was where food was prepared and shared. It was where conversation happened, and storytelling, and the quiet, companionable silence of people who are simply comfortable being together. The light of the fire also allowed work to continue after dark. In the shortened winter days, when daylight was scarce, the extended illumination of the fire-lit evening hours was genuinely valuable. Tool making required good light to see the fine detail of the stone. Sewing required light to thread the needle and make the careful stitches that held garments and shelters together. The firelight was not as good as daylight for these fine tasks, of course. It flickered and shifted. It cast unpredictable shadows, but it was warm and close and adequate for many purposes, and it extended the productive hours of the day well into the night. And then there was the quality of the fire's light itself. Firelight is fundamentally different from any artificial light we typically use today. It is warm in color, predominantly reds and oranges and yellows, and it is always moving, never static. The shadows it casts are large and soft-edged, always shifting slowly with the movement of the flames. On the curved walls of a cave, firelight creates a constantly moving landscape of light and shadow that has a quality almost like breathing, as if the stone itself were alive. Sitting beside a campfire in a cave, watching the play of light on the walls, is an experience that speaks to something very old in us, something that has not changed. The smoke from the fire rose and found its way out through the upper sections of the cave entrance and through any natural cracks or fissures in the ceiling. In a well-chosen cave, this happened with reasonable efficiency. The interior air remained breathable, with a light haze of smoke that settled into everything, into the hair and skins and stone, creating that distinctive smell of a lived-in cave that archaeological excavations can still, in some cases, detect today. The hearth was also the center of food preparation, which we will explore in more detail a little later. For now, let us simply note that the combination of warmth, light, cooked food, social gathering, and psychological safety that the fire provided made it, in a very real sense, the heart of cave life. Remove the fire, and the cave becomes merely a shelter, cold and dark. Add the fire, and it becomes a home. Sleeping arrangements, when darkness settled fully over the valley and the last light faded from the sky at the cave entrance, the sleeping arrangements of the group became the central organization of the interior space. Sleep, for these early people, was not necessarily the single, consolidated 8-hour block that modern life often imposes. Research into pre-industrial and traditional sleeping patterns suggests that natural human sleep is often biphasic, meaning it occurs in two distinct periods separated by a quiet period of wakefulness in the middle of the night. During this middle period, people might tend the fire, speak quietly with those nearby, eat a small amount if food was available, or simply rest and let the mind drift before sleep returned. This pattern is supported by historical records and by studies of people living in environments without artificial lighting, and there is no reason to think that Paleolithic cave dwellers would have been any different. The sleeping positions and arrangements within the cave were organized by practical and social logic. Those who needed the most warmth slept nearest the fire. Small children typically slept close to their mothers, the warm physical contact providing both heat and the security of familiar presence. Infants were held or wrapped against adult bodies, kept not only warm but continuously close in the manner that is natural and instinctive across all human cultures. The bedding was made of whatever soft material was available. Animal skins were the primary component, and a good sleeping nest might consist of several layers, a lower layer of dry grass or plant material to provide insulation from the cold stone floor, then one or more animal skins on top of that, with additional skins available to draw over the body for additional warmth. The skins of large animals like deer, bison, or horse were among the most useful, being large enough to wrap around the body effectively. Smaller skins could be used as additions or fillers, layered together to create adequate coverage. The preparation of animal skins for sleeping and clothing was one of the most time-intensive and skilled crafts of cave life. A fresh skin is a complex organic material that must be thoroughly cleaned, softened, and in some cases treated to prevent it from becoming stiff and inflexible as it dries. The process typically began with scraping, using a stone scraper to remove the flesh and fat from the inner surface of the skin. This was careful, repetitive work, requiring a consistent pressure and angle to be effective without damaging the hide. Then the skin was worked mechanically, stretched and kneaded and rubbed repeatedly over many sessions to soften the fibers. Brains of the animal or other fat-rich materials were sometimes rubbed into the skin to help preserve its flexibility. The finished product was a supple, soft material that could be cut and sewn into whatever shape was needed. Sewing required needles, and the needles used by Paleolithic people were among the most refined of their tools. Made from bone or ivory, carefully shaped and smoothed to a fine point, with a small hole drilled through the eye end using a stone borer, these needles are found at many archaeological sites and attest to a level of fine manual skill and attention to detail that is impressive by any standard. The thread used was typically animal sinew, the tough connective tissue that runs along muscle groups, split into fine strands when fresh and then allowed to dry in that form. Sinew thread is extremely strong and slightly elastic, making it well suited to the stresses of garments worn during active outdoor work. The sleeping area of the cave, once people had settled for the night, would have been quiet and warm, filled with the sound of steady breathing and the gentle crackle of the maintained fire. Occasionally, someone would shift position, turning over beneath their skins, or an infant would stir and be quieted. The fire, tended by whoever was awake during the middle of night quiet period, would hold its steady orange glow. The shadows on the walls would continue their slow, patient movement. Outside, the night sounds of the valley might be audible at the cave entrance. Distant calls of nocturnal birds, the sound of wind moving through the dry grass. Occasionally, further away, the sounds of larger animals moving through the darkness. These sounds were familiar, They were the background texture of the night, and like the crackling of the fire, they sat at the edge of consciousness rather than demanding attention. They were the sounds of a world going about its business in the dark, as it always had, as it always would. And inside the cave, the small group of people slept on, warm and close together, the fire burning low and steady, the stone walls holding their heat, the night moving slowly toward the pale early light of another dawn. Food preparation inside the cave food in the Paleolithic world was both more varied and more directly encountered than most of us today experience. The people living in and around this cave were not farmers. They did not plant seeds or tend crops or keep domestic animals. They were hunter-gatherers, meaning that all of their food came directly from what the surrounding landscape provided, through their own effort and knowledge and skill. The plant foods available to them were seasonal and varied by region, but could include roots and tubers dug from the ground, berries and fruits during the warmer months, nuts and seeds in autumn, various edible leaves and shoots in spring. All of these required detailed knowledge to exploit effectively, which plants were edible and which were poisonous, where to find them when they were available, how to prepare them to maximize their nutritional value. This knowledge was not written in any book. It was held in the minds of the people themselves, accumulated over generations of observation and experience, and passed on through teaching and demonstration. Animal foods were obtained through hunting and through the opportunistic collection of whatever edible things the landscape offered. Shellfish near coastlines and rivers, eggs from bird nests in season, honey from wild beehives discovered in hollow trees. The hunting of large animals, mammoths, bison, horses, reindeer, was a major undertaking that required planning, cooperation, knowledge of animal behavior, and physical skill. It was not an everyday activity. A successful large animal hunt could provide a group of a dozen people with enough meat for many days, which shaped the rhythm of their lives in important ways. Inside the cave, food was prepared and consumed around the fire. Meat could be cooked in several ways. The simplest was direct fire roasting, placing pieces of meat on flat stones beside the fire or on simple wooden supports above the flames. This was quick and practical, producing well-cooked food with a minimum of preparation. Larger cuts of meat or whole small animals might be buried in the hot ash and coals at the edge of the fire, where they would cook slowly over an hour or two in a steady, even heat, emerging well cooked through to the center. Stone boiling was another technique used by many prehistoric peoples around the world. Without ceramic vessels capable of surviving direct fire, water could not easily be boiled in a container set over flames, but water could be heated by placing fire-heated stones into it. A container made of animal hide or birch bark, or sometimes a natural stone depression in the cave floor, could hold water, and by dropping a series of fire-heated stones into it, the water could be brought to a boil and maintained there long enough to cook plant materials, extract nutrients from bones, or prepare any of a variety of soft foods. The cooking of food on and around the cave fire would have produced a constant variety of smells within the interior. The smell of roasting meat. The faintly sweet, slightly smoky smell of plant materials being cooked in water. The sharp smell of fresh fat rendered in heat. These smells would have mixed with the background smell of the cave, the smoke, the stone, the skins, the earth floor, creating an olfactory texture that was as specific and unique to that place as any fingerprint. Bones were not wasted. After the meat had been consumed, the bones were cracked to extract the marrow inside, a dense and calorie-rich substance that was highly valued. The cracking of bones for marrow is one of the most persistent and widely distributed behaviors in the human archaeological record. found across hundreds of thousands of years and across nearly every part of the world where early humans lived. The marrow inside a large bone like a femur is rich in fat and protein, and the effort of cracking the bone was always well repaid. Plant foods were often processed in the cave before cooking. Seeds might be ground between two stones to break them down into a coarse flour, which could then be mixed with water and cooked on a hot stone beside the fire. Roots and tubers were scraped and peeled. Nuts were cracked. Berries were sorted and cleaned. This kind of food processing work was done sitting near the fire in good light, and it was often social work, done in company, accompanied by quiet conversation. The distribution of food within the group followed social rules that would have been understood by everyone, though those rules varied from group to group and situation to situation. In general, the sharing of food was a fundamental social practice. A successful hunter returning with meat shared it. A person who had gathered a large quantity of nuts or berries shared them. This generosity was not simply altruistic, though the bonds of affection and loyalty within small groups were certainly real. It was also deeply practical. In a world where food sources were unpredictable, and the difference between a successful and unsuccessful day could be significant, the principle of sharing ensured that no single individual or family bore the full risk alone. When you shared your food today, you were also, in a sense, investing in the likelihood that someone would share with you tomorrow. Children in the cave were fed carefully. The youngest, still nursing, received their food directly from their mothers. Older infants and toddlers were given soft, pre-chewed or pre-processed food, eased through the transition to solid eating with patience and attention. Growing children ate alongside the adults, receiving portions appropriate to their size and appetite, observed and attended to by the multiple adults of the group who shared in the care of the community's children. After eating, the remains of the meal were dealt with in ways that kept the living space as clean and usable as possible. Bones and other waste were pushed toward the edges of the living area or carried outside the cave. The fire was managed to prevent the accumulation of excessive ash. The general orderliness of the interior space was maintained not through any formal rules, but through the practical wisdom that comes from many people sharing a limited space over a long period of time. Tools and daily work. The stone tools made and used by Paleolithic cave dwellers were not simple or crude objects. They were the products of a sophisticated technical tradition that had been developing and refining itself over hundreds of thousands of years, and they reflected a deep understanding of the materials from which they were made. Flint was the most prized material for tool making in many parts of Europe. Flint is a form of fine-grained silica that fractures in a controlled and predictable way when struck correctly, producing sharp edges of remarkable quality. A fresh flint edge can be sharper than a modern surgical steel blade, and in the hands of a skilled knapper, flint can be shaped into an extraordinary variety of forms suited to an equally extraordinary variety of purposes. The process of knapping flint begins with the selection of a suitable piece of raw material. Not all flint is equal. Good flint for tool making needs to be homogeneous in texture, free of internal cracks or irregularities that would cause it to fracture unpredictably, and of a quality that produces clean, sharp edges. Finding good flint often required travel to known source locations, sometimes many kilometers away from the cave. Good flint sources were remembered and revisited across generations, like the cave itself, as reliable locations in a known and understood landscape. Once a suitable piece of flint was in hand, the process of shaping it was done by removing flakes from the surface through controlled percussion. A hammer stone, a smooth, hard stone of the right size and weight, was used to strike the flint at precise locations and angles, removing flakes of predetermined size and shape. The skill in this was enormous. The napper needed to understand, intuitively and through long practice, exactly how the stone would respond to a blow at any given point and angle, predicting and controlling the path of fracture through the material. This was not hit and miss guesswork. It was refined physical intelligence, the product of years of learning and practice. The tools produced by this process included scrapers, used for working animal hides, removing meat from bones, and 100 other tasks requiring a sharp, controlled edge. There were burins, small chisel-like tools used for engraving bone and antler and for drilling small holes. There were points, carefully shaped to function as spear tips or knife blades. There were blades, long thin flakes with parallel edges that could be used as cutting tools for a wide variety of purposes. And there were more specialized forms for specific needs, borers and notched pieces and backed blades, each reflecting a particular functional requirement that someone had thought about and solved through the medium of stone. Work on stone tools was done in the cave, typically near the fire where the light was best. The sound of knapping, that crisp, sharp clicking of stone on stone, would have been a regular background sound of the cave's daily life. The debris produced by tool making, the small flakes and chips and exhausted cores, accumulated in the areas where people worked and can still be found today in the archaeological layers of cave sites, forming dense clusters that tell researchers exactly where particular activities took place thousands of years ago. Bone and antler were also important materials for tools and implements. They are more flexible than stone and can be worked into shapes that stone does not permit. Antler in particular has excellent mechanical properties for certain tools. Needles, as we mentioned earlier, harpoon heads, hooks, handles and grips for stone tools, beads and ornaments. The working of antler typically involved a combination of techniques: scoring with a flint burin, soaking in water to soften, bending, and careful shaping. Wood was certainly used for a variety of purposes, though it survives poorly in the archaeological record, and our knowledge of wooden tools and objects from the Paleolithic is therefore incomplete. Wooden spear shafts, which have been found at some sites, were important for hunting. Wooden handles for stone tools improved grip and leverage. Wooden supports of various kinds were likely used within the cave to help organize space and hang things. But the full extent of Paleolithic woodworking is partly hidden from us by the simple fact that wood decays over millennia while stone does not. Daily work in the cave and its immediate surroundings was not constant labor. There were busy periods and quiet periods. A successful hunt brought a flurry of butchering, processing, and preparation. A quiet day in midwinter, when travel was difficult and the resources of the immediate area well known and already exploited, might be a day of sitting by the fire, making tools, mending clothes, talking, resting. The idea that hunter-gatherers spent every waking hour in exhausting survival effort is not supported by the evidence. Studies of modern hunter-gatherer groups suggest that the actual time spent in direct food-getting activity is often surprisingly limited, perhaps 4 to 6 hours a day on average, leaving substantial time for rest, social interaction, craft, and creative activity. This relative spaciousness of time was part of what allowed the flowering of the artistic and symbolic behaviors that we see in the archaeological record of Upper Paleolithic cave sites. The cave paintings, the carved figurines, the decorated objects. These were not luxuries squeezed into the corners of a desperate survival existence. They were the natural expression of people with time to think, to imagine, to create, and with the social structures that gave that creation meaning and purpose. Storytelling around the fire in the evenings, when the work of the day was done and the group had gathered around the fire, there was a time that belonged to something other than the practical business of survival. It was the time of storytelling. We cannot hear those stories now. They were not written down. They were not preserved in any form that survives. But we know from the universality of storytelling across all known human cultures, from the evidence of symbolic thought and artistic expression found at Paleolithic sites, and from what we can infer about the social needs of small, closely bound groups of people, that stories were told. Stories were told every evening, in every season, in every cave where people gathered around fire in the long Paleolithic night. What would those stories have been about? In the most general sense, they would have been about the world as those people knew it, about the animals they hunted and the plants they gathered, rendered not merely as food sources, but as presences with personalities and habits, and perhaps intentions of their own. About the landscape they moved through, the rivers and hills and valleys that shaped their territory, given names and characters and histories. About the people of the group, their relationships and histories, and the events that had shaped them. About the dead, who were remembered and in some sense still present in the stories told about them. There were likely explanatory stories too, stories that tried to account for the nature of the world. Why does the sun move across the sky? What are the stars? Why does the cold come and the warmth return? Why do the animals behave as they do? We cannot know the specific answers these people gave to these questions. But the questions themselves are universal, arising from the same quality of curious, meaning-making human consciousness that still generates these questions today. And the stories that answered them would have been told and retold, refined over generations, held in the collective memory of the group as a shared understanding of reality. The firelight was the perfect setting for stories. The dancing shadows on the cave walls created a naturally dynamic visual environment that a skilled storyteller could animate with gesture and voice, making the shadows part of the performance. The warmth and the closeness of the people gathered around the fire created the right atmosphere, intimate and focused, the outside world temporarily shut away. We know that Paleolithic people had a sophisticated relationship with the concept of sound within caves. Some researchers have noted that the locations of cave paintings within deep cave systems often correspond to places where the acoustic properties of the cave are particularly interesting, where echoes are pronounced, where sounds seem to come from the walls themselves, where the cave's natural resonance creates unusual effects. This suggests that sound was an important dimension of the experience of the cave, and that the acoustic qualities of particular spaces may have been deliberately sought for particular kinds of activity. Imagine the voice of a storyteller, not loud, just carrying, moving through a cave's interior in the evening. The echo of it very slight, returning from the stone, the fire crackling beneath the words. The faces of the listeners turned toward the speaker, lit orange and gold, eyes reflecting the flames. Children leaning against adults, half listening, half dreaming, the words washing over them like the warmth of the fire itself. This scene, in its essential elements, is one of the most fundamental and recurring of all human scenes. It has been played out in every culture, in every time, in every part of the world. The specific stories change, the languages change, the setting changes. But the basic situation, people gathered around a common warmth, sharing stories in the dark, building and maintaining the fabric of shared understanding that makes a community possible, is as old as anything we call human. And in the cave, in the flickering light, this essential human act was perhaps at its most elemental. No buildings, no institutions, no hierarchies of literacy or technology separated the storyteller from the story, the speaker from the listener. Just the fire, the stone, the night, and the words. Children growing up in caves, the children of cave-dwelling communities, entered a world that was intimate and immediate and completely defined by the group of people around them. From the very beginning of life, a child in this world was embedded in a web of close relationships, held and tended not just by a mother, but by the extended network of adults who shared the cave and shared responsibility for the well-being of the whole group. Infants spent their first months in almost constant physical contact with their caregivers. In a world without carriages or cribs or separate nursery spaces, a baby was carried against the body, in a sling made of soft skin, or simply held in arms. This constant contact was not merely comforting for the infant. It was thermally necessary, keeping a small body warm in an environment that could be cold. It was also protective, keeping the infant close in a world that was genuine in its wildness. As children grew into toddlerhood and early childhood, the cave and its immediate surroundings became their first and most complete learning environment. Everything within the cave was potentially interesting, potentially instructive. The tools that adults worked with, the fire that must be watched but not touched, a lesson learned perhaps with considerable care, and many warnings from the adults nearby. The skins and materials being processed, the food being prepared, the coming and going of adults during the day, the social interactions around the fire in the evenings. Children learned by watching, they learned by doing. They were given age-appropriate tasks from an early age, small contributions to the collective work of the group that were both genuinely useful and educational. A young child might help gather dry grass for bedding. A slightly older child might help process nuts or seeds. An adolescent might begin accompanying adults on foraging trips, learning the landscape and its resources through direct experience, guided by the knowledge of those who knew it best. The learning of stone tool making was a long process that began in childhood and continued into adolescence and early adulthood. Very young children might play with pieces of flint, becoming familiar with the material and its properties without any formal instruction. As they grew, they would watch skilled adults napping and begin to try for themselves, gradually developing the manual skill and perceptual understanding required to produce useful tools. By the time they reached adulthood, a person raised in a Paleolithic tool-making tradition would have years of accumulated practice behind them, their hands knowing the stone intimately. Play was an important part of childhood, as it is in all human cultures. Children played together, chasing and tumbling, inventing games, constructing small worlds from the materials around them. They played near the cave entrance on warm days, in the daylight, within sight of the adults working nearby. They explored the immediate surroundings of the cave under appropriate supervision, discovering the insects and plants and small stones that filled their immediate world. The transition from childhood to adulthood was gradual and practical, defined less by formal ritual than by the steady accumulation of skills and responsibilities. As a young person became capable of making a full contribution to the group's activities, they became, in the practical sense, an adult member of the community. This transition typically occurred in adolescence, though the specific timing varied between individuals. Growing up in a cave community meant growing up deeply embedded in a particular way of life, deeply knowledgeable about a particular landscape, deeply attached to the small group of people who constituted your entire social world. The word for home in this context was not really the cave itself, though the cave was part of it. Home was the group. Home was the fire. Home was the network of familiar relationships that gave life its structure and meaning. And the children who grew up in these caves, who learned to knap flint and read the landscape and tell the stories and tend the fire, would carry all of that knowledge and all of those relationships with them throughout their lives, passing it on in their turn to the children who would grow up around their own fires in their own seasons of the world. Seasonal changes, the life organized around the cave, was not the same in every season. The Paleolithic year turned through its phases with profound effects on every aspect of daily existence, and the people who lived within that turning learned to understand and anticipate and adapt to its rhythm with a sophistication born of intimate necessity. Winter was the long season, the defining season. In the northern latitudes, where many of the most thoroughly studied cave sites are found, winter could last 5 or 6 months, a long, cold, dark time during which travel was difficult, resources were limited, and the cave became most completely the center of life. The group might remain within a relatively small radius during the deepest winter weeks, ranging out only for specific and necessary purposes, returning each day to the warmth and shelter of the cave. During winter, the work of the cave shifted accordingly. With less active foraging and hunting possible on many days, the indoor crafts became more central. Tool-making was extensive winter work. Skin processing and sewing occupied many hours. The maintenance of the cave itself, keeping the bedding dry and fresh, managing the fire and its ash, keeping the interior space organized and functional, required ongoing attention. Social life deepened in winter, the long evenings giving more time to conversation and storytelling, the reduced pressure of food finding allowing for a kind of spacious domestic life that summer's busyness did not always permit. Food stores managed in autumn became important in the deepest weeks of winter. Large quantities of dried or frozen meat from autumn hunts could sustain a group through periods when fresh food was difficult to obtain. The cold itself was a preservative, and meat left in a cold part of the cave or in a sheltered outdoor cache could remain usable for weeks or months. This was understood and exploited deliberately. The approach of spring was felt and observed carefully. The lengthening of the days, each one a few minutes longer than the last, was noticeable and meaningful. The gradual softening of the air. The first appearance of certain plants, very early shoots pushing through the cold ground, signaling the approaching shift of the season. The return of migratory birds, heard first as distant calls before they were visible. The changing behavior of the animals in the valley, the restlessness of herds as the snow began to melt, the sense of movement and transition in the wider world. Spring was a time of expansion. The group could range more widely as conditions improved. New plant foods became available, often welcomed after the limited plant variety of winter. Young animals appeared in the valley, less wary and easier to approach than adults. The river ran higher and faster with snowmelt, and fish might be taken from its waters. Energy levels, perhaps somewhat constrained by the cold and the shorter diet of winter, began to recover. There was a quality of renewal in spring that people must have felt directly and responded to with a kind of lifting relief and renewed vitality. Summer was the most active season. Daylight lasted long into the evening, extending the working day substantially. The full range of plant foods was available. Animal populations were at their peak. Travel was easiest. Some groups ranged far from their winter cave during summer, following the movements of game herds or visiting distant resource locations that were inaccessible in other seasons. They might camp in open-air sites during summer travels, using constructed shelters of wood and skin rather than stone caves, returning to the cave for winter. Other groups remained in or near their cave through all seasons, making shorter seasonal movements but keeping the cave as their permanent base. Autumn was a season of preparation. The cooling air and shortening days signaled the coming winter, and the work of the autumn months was shaped by the need to be ready for it. Autumn hunts targeting animals in their best pre-winter condition produced meat that was dried and stored. Plant foods were gathered intensively while they were still available, nuts and seeds and roots that could be stored for later use. Bedding materials were refreshed and supplemented. Clothing was assessed and repaired or replaced as needed. The cave itself might be improved in various ways. The floor cleaned and leveled, new dry grass brought in, materials for fire laid in a convenient store near the hearth. This seasonal rhythm was not experienced as a burden. It was the structure of life. The turning of the year, the recurrence of known seasons with their known qualities and requirements, gave time its shape and meaning. The people who lived within this rhythm were not primitive beings struggling against nature. They were skilled participants in a complex system that they understood deeply, moving with its currents rather than against them, adapting with a flexibility and intelligence that had been refined over countless generations. Dangers outside the world outside, the cave was not dangerous in every moment, in every direction. But it was a world that required attention, and within it there were genuine dangers that the people who lived here understood and managed through knowledge and caution. Large predators were part of the landscape. Cave lions, larger than modern African lions, ranged across the Eurasian steppe. Cave hyenas scavenged widely and could be aggressive. Cave bears, massive animals that used some of the same cave systems as humans, though typically not the same sections at the same times, were a presence in the landscape that required awareness. Wolves moved in packs through the valleys. None of these animals was a constant or inevitable threat. They, like the humans, were following the logic of their own lives, avoiding conflict where possible, engaging only when necessary. But the possibility of encounter was real, and the people of the cave managed it through the same combination of knowledge and attention that managed every other aspect of their relationship with the natural world. Children were carefully watched when outside, keeping them close to adults and within sight at all times. Travel in the open landscape was done in groups, and the awareness of everyone in the group was distributed across the surrounding environment in a way that made dangerous surprise unlikely. Noise was used strategically, loud human presence tending to cause large predators to give way, quiet, careful movement used when observing prey animals that might flee. The weather itself could be dangerous. Severe winter storms could reduce visibility to near zero and make travel through the open landscape genuinely hazardous. Deep cold could be life-threatening for anyone caught far from shelter without adequate clothing or fire. The people of the cave were careful and experienced about weather, observing its signs and anticipating its shifts in the same way they observed and anticipated everything else about their environment. River crossings were another consideration. A river swollen with snowmelt in spring could be difficult and dangerous to ford. The technique and timing of crossings were part of the knowledge of the landscape. Known shallow crossings were remembered and used. The condition of the river was observed and taken into account in planning travel. But it is worth emphasizing that the relationship these people had with the dangers of their world was not one of fear and helplessness. It was one of informed engagement. They understood their landscape profoundly. They had tools and knowledge and the accumulated wisdom of many generations of experience. They had each other. The small group moving through the valley was not a collection of isolated individuals facing a hostile world. It was a coordinated social unit with combined knowledge and capability far exceeding what any individual could bring to bear alone. The cave, in this context, was their base of safety, not because it protected them from everything, but because it was the known center of their world, the place of warmth and community and rest from which all engagement with the wider world began and to which it returned. Leaving the cave in the morning was not an act of stepping into danger. It was an act of entering the familiar, understood, managed landscape in which they lived, and which they knew better than we know our own streets and offices and routes of daily movement. Decorating cave walls among the most moving and mysterious aspects of Paleolithic cave life is the art. Across Europe and in a growing number of sites around the world, the walls and ceilings of ancient caves are decorated with images that were made by people living tens of thousands of years ago, and they stop us every time we encounter them with their beauty and their strange immediacy. The most famous of these sites are in France and Spain. Lascaux in the Dordogne region of France, Altamira in northern Spain, Chauvet in the Ardèche Valley of southern France. But there are hundreds of others, some well-known and carefully studied, others still being discovered by researchers and cavers in remote mountain regions. The images on the cave walls include animals predominantly. Horses, bison, mammoths, aurochs, deer, rhinoceroses, lions, bears, and many others are depicted with a skill and naturalism that continues to astonish every viewer. These are not simple sketches or crude outlines. They are accomplished representations, capturing the posture and musculature and characteristic quality of each animal with an economy of line and a sure hand that speaks of practiced artistic skill. Some are monumental in scale, covering meters of ceiling or wall. Some are small and delicate. Some are made with a single flowing line. Others are built up with shading and multiple strokes, creating a sense of volume and three-dimensionality. There are also hand prints, made by placing a hand against the wall and blowing pigment around it, leaving a negative image. These are among the most personal and direct of all the cave images, the literal shape of a specific human hand pressed against stone tens of thousands of years ago. Seeing them, you feel the presence of that person with unusual directness. There are geometric marks of various kinds, dots and lines and grids and patterns whose meaning we do not fully understand, but whose consistent repetition across many sites and many thousands of years suggests that they carried real meaning for the people who made them. The pigments used for the paintings came from the natural world. Ochre, an iron-rich mineral that occurs in shades ranging from yellow to deep red, was used extensively. Manganese dioxide, a dark mineral, was used for black lines. Charcoal was used for drawing. These materials were ground into powder, mixed with liquids such as water or animal fat, and applied to the wall with hands, pads of fur or moss, and what were effectively early brushes made of plant fiber or animal hair. The creation of these images was not a casual activity. It was deliberate, prepared, and in many cases took place in the deepest, and most inaccessible sections of cave systems, well beyond the light of any natural illumination. To reach these painting sites, people carried their lamps, small stone dishes filled with animal fat and fitted with a wick of plant fiber or moss, burning with a small steady flame, capable of illuminating a few meters of cave wall in their warm, flickering light. Making these journeys, moving through low passages and ascending through chambers with these small lamps, carrying their pigments and their tools, was an intentional and effortful act, the nature of which we can only partially understand. What did these images mean? The honest answer is that we do not know, not with certainty. There are many theories, and the academic discussion of Paleolithic art is a rich and ongoing field of inquiry. Some researchers have proposed that the images were related to hunting magic, that depicting animals in a specific way conferred some kind of spiritual advantage in the hunt. Others have proposed that the caves themselves were understood as entrances to an other world, and that the images were communications with forces or beings understood to inhabit that other world. Others have focused on the social and communicative functions of art, understanding the cave paintings as a form of shared symbolic language that reinforced group identity and transmitted cultural knowledge. What we can say with confidence is that the people who made these images were not doing something random or meaningless. They were expressing something about the animals they lived among and depended upon. Something about their own presence in the world, their awareness of themselves as beings who made marks and created images and inhabited a world saturated with significance. Something that reached beyond the immediate practical business of daily life into a dimension of experience that we recognize, even at a distance of 30,000 years, as genuinely human. Back in our cave, on a quieter scale than the grand painted galleries of Lascaux or Chauvet, there might be simpler marks. A handprint near the entrance, pressed with ochre-covered fingers by a child watching an adult do the same. A line of dots along the lower wall near the sleeping area. A rough but recognizable outline of a horse, sketched in charcoal by someone spending a quiet afternoon by the fire. The impulse to mark the walls, to leave a trace, to say in some form I was here, and this is what I saw, and this is what I felt, was present in the simplest cave as much as in the most elaborate painted sanctuary. Community life, the community of the cave, was small. Groups of hunter-gatherers typically ranged in size from perhaps 15 to perhaps 50 individuals at any given time, with the average often closer to the lower end of that range during lean periods and the higher end when resources were abundant and multiple family groups came together. Small groups function differently from larger ones. When you live with 15 or 20 people, you know every one of them with extraordinary intimacy. You know their habits and their moods and their skills and their histories. You know who is reliable and who is less so. You know who is good at finding particular plants and who has the steadiest hand for fine tool work. You know who tells the best stories and who sings in their sleep. This degree of mutual knowledge creates a social world of considerable complexity, where every interaction is embedded in a rich context of relationship history and ongoing obligation. The social structure of Paleolithic groups is another area where we have partial evidence and many open questions. What we can infer is that these were relatively egalitarian societies, without the rigid hierarchies of rank and power that characterize many later complex societies. Leadership existed, but in the form of recognized expertise and respected knowledge, rather than inherited position or forceful authority. The person who was most knowledgeable about a particular domain, the best hunter, the most skilled toolmaker, the most experienced gatherer, had influence in that domain through the practical value of their knowledge rather than through formal authority. This does not mean that there were no tensions or conflicts within the group. Small, close-knit communities have their own social dynamics, and the proximity of daily cave life created both the deepest intimacy and the conditions for friction. Disagreements over resources, over relationships, over the small everyday matters of shared space and shared work were inevitable and were managed through the social mechanisms that all human communities develop over time. Negotiation, humor, the intervention of respected elders, the patient work of maintaining relationships that were too important to allow to deteriorate. The cave was small enough that unresolved conflict was genuinely disruptive, and the social intelligence required to manage it was real and valued. Cooperation was the fundamental principle. The group functioned because its members contributed to its functioning, each according to their capability and the needs of the moment. An elder who could no longer hunt or travel far could still make tools, still process skins, still care for children, still carry and transmit the accumulated knowledge of a lifetime. A young adult at the height of their physical capability could range far and contribute greatly to the food supply, drawing on the knowledge of those older than them to guide their efforts. Children contributed small practical tasks appropriate to their development while receiving the full investment of the group's protective attention. There were occasions when smaller family groups from the same or related communities came together in larger seasonal gatherings. These gatherings served multiple important functions. They were occasions for exchanging information about resources and landscape conditions, for sharing new techniques or materials, for renewing social bonds with people seen less frequently. They were also occasions for the exchange of mates between groups, which prevented the genetic and social problems of too close interbreeding within small, isolated populations. Young people of marriageable age meeting at these seasonal gatherings formed partnerships that created connections between groups, bonds of relationship that linked communities across the wider landscape in networks of obligation and affinity. During these gatherings, the creative and expressive life of the community expanded. More people meant more stories, more songs if songs there were, more opportunity for the display of skill and the exchange of ideas. The cave paintings at the grandest sites may have been made or renewed during such gatherings, a collective artistic effort that left a lasting mark on the stone and created a shared symbolic space for the larger community. Gift exchange between individuals and groups was an important social practice. Objects of value, fine tools, shells or stones used as ornaments, rare materials from distant places, moved through networks of exchange that extended far beyond the immediate territory of any single group. These exchanges were not merely commercial transactions. They were social acts, creating and maintaining relationships of reciprocal obligation that extended the web of connection across the landscape. Within the cave, the daily rhythms of communal life created the texture of belonging. Waking together in the morning, the shared slow emergence from sleep as the fire was built up and the day began. The division of the day's tasks according to ability and need. The coming together again in the evening, the shared meal and the long fireside hours. The sounds of sleep rising from the dark interior as the night deepened. All of this, repeated daily and seasonally across the years of a lifetime, created a form of community that was in some ways simpler than what most of us experience today, and in other ways more complete. The slow transition away from caves, the shift away from cave life, did not happen overnight. It did not happen in a single generation or even several. It was a gradual process, unfolding across thousands of years, driven by slow changes in climate, in technology, in the organization of human society, that accumulated over time into something that eventually looked different from what had come before. The end of the last major glacial period began roughly 15,000 years ago and continued slowly over several thousand years. As the great ice sheets retreated northward, the climate of much of Europe and Western Asia shifted towards something warmer and wetter. The open, cold grasslands that had supported the mammoth steppe ecosystem gradually gave way to forest. The large, cold, adapted animals, woolly mammoths, woolly rhinoceroses, the giant deer with their enormous spreading antlers, either adapted or slowly diminished and eventually disappeared as their habitat changed. New communities of animals established themselves in the spreading forests, different species requiring different hunting techniques and different knowledge to exploit. Human populations adapted to these changes with the flexibility and intelligence that characterizes the human lineage. New tools emerged, suited to the new conditions. The Mesolithic period, which followed the Paleolithic, was characterized by a shift towards smaller, more versatile tools, by the use of waterways for travel and food, by adaptations to the new forested environments that were spreading across the post-glacial landscape. As the climate warmed and stabilized, the distribution of suitable cave sites changed in its relevance. Caves had been most valuable in the cold, open landscapes of the Ice Age, where the absence of dense woodland meant that the natural shelter of stone was particularly important. As forests expanded, the possibilities for constructing shelters from wood became much greater, and the relative advantage of stone caves over well-built wooden structures diminished. A group with the knowledge and tools to build a substantial wooden shelter could now choose their location much more freely, not constrained to the geography of limestone cliffs and rocky outcrops where caves naturally occurred. The transition to agriculture, which began in the Near East around 12,000 years ago and spread gradually across the world over the following several thousand years, further changed the relationship between people and the landscape. Farming communities needed to remain in one place through the growing season, which required substantial, permanent buildings. Villages of mud, brick, or wattle and daub construction replaced the seasonal flexibility of cave-based hunter-gatherer life. The cave, as a form of shelter, became less central to the way most people organized their existence. But the transition was not abrupt, and it was not universal. In many parts of the world, cave use continued long after the Paleolithic, into the Mesolithic, the Neolithic, and even into historical times. Shepherds used caves as seasonal shelters for themselves and their flocks. Communities in certain regions continued to inhabit cave systems as permanent or semi-permanent homes. In some places, caves remained sacred spaces long after they ceased to be ordinary living spaces, visited for ritual or ceremonial purposes, the ancient paintings on their walls perhaps still visible, and perhaps still carrying some of the weight of meaning they had been given by those who first made them. The deep caves with their remarkable paintings were not simply abandoned and forgotten by the people who came after. The evidence from some sites suggests that later peoples visited these painted caves, that they added to or responded to the earlier images in various ways, that the sense of these places as significant and special persisted across generations and even across cultural transitions. The paintings at Chauvet, among the oldest known, were made roughly 36,000 years ago, but the cave continued to be visited and used for thousands of years after that initial flourishing of image making. The cave held the memory of its use, and people returning to it across the millennia could see and respond to the evidence of all those who had been there before. This continuity across time is perhaps one of the most profound aspects of the cave as a human space. Unlike a wooden house that decays, unlike a camp in the open that leaves almost no trace, the cave persists. The stone endures. The paintings on the walls, made in pigments pressed into the slight irregularities of the stone surface, have survived for tens of thousands of years in the stable, cool, dark environment of their deep chambers. They are the most durable record we have of the interior life of our most ancient ancestors, and they speak to us still, across all the distance of time, with a directness and beauty that no translation is required to understand. The people who made those images and who lived in and around the caves where they are found are not distant or alien to us. They were people. They had the same basic emotional and cognitive and social architecture that we have. They loved their children and told stories by firelight and felt the relief of shelter from the cold and looked up at the same stars we look at today. The specific details of their world were profoundly different from ours. The tools, the animals, the landscape, the social world, all of these were different. But the underlying human experience, the experience of being alive and conscious and embedded in a community and reaching toward meaning, was recognizably the same. And when we look at the paintings they left behind, we are looking at the evidence of that sameness across the vastness of time. A horse, rendered in flowing charcoal lines on a cave wall 30,000 years ago, is still a horse. The hand that pressed its outline in ochre on the stone was a hand like ours, attached to a person like us. Gentle closing reflection, let us return now to the cave one final time. Let us let the story settle back into its beginning. The fire has burned low. It is late in the evening, deep in whatever season this particular night belongs to. The group has gathered from the day's activities, has eaten, has spoken together in the quiet voices of the fire-lit hours. The stories have been told, and the fire has been tended, and the long day has completed itself. One by one, the people have settled into sleep. The children went first, as they always do, drifting off against the warmth of the adults beside them, their breathing slowing and deepening into the steady rhythm of deep sleep. The older members of the group followed, the long day in their bodies, grateful for the rest. Now only one or two people remain awake, sitting quietly beside the diminished fire, their eyes soft and unfocused, their thoughts drifting. The fire has become mostly coals now. It does not crackle anymore, not with any real vigor. It breathes more than it crackles, a slow pulse of orange and red in the darkness, warm and steady. The cave's interior has settled into a quiet that is very nearly complete, the occasional soft sound of someone turning in their sleep. The distant, barely audible sound of the wind moving across the valley entrance. The stone walls hold their warmth patiently, as they always do. The curved ceiling above catches a last little light from the coals and holds it gently. The smell of smoke and earth and animal skin is familiar and comfortable as the weight of sleep itself. Outside the cave entrance, the night is at its deepest hour. The stars have wheeled slowly across the sky through the long dark hours, and now they are beginning their slow westward descent toward the horizon, and the sky at the eastern edge of the valley is not quite black anymore, not quite. Just a very faint and subtle shift in the quality of the darkness that speaks of the dawn still hours away, but approaching, as it always approaches, as it has always approached, as it will always approach. These people sleeping in their cave, in their animal skin warmth, beside their breathing fire, are not at the beginning of something that leads inevitably and triumphantly to us. They are not a rough draft awaiting revision. They are complete. Their lives are full. Their world is as richly textured and as full of meaning as any world that has existed before or since. They understand things we have forgotten. They carry knowledge we will spend centuries trying to reconstruct. They are capable and intelligent and deeply human, and they are at home here, in this cave, in this valley, in this cold and beautiful world. The person still awake by the fire reaches forward and places one more small piece of wood at the edge of the coals, not enough to start the fire blazing again, just enough to feed it through the last dark hours. The wood settles into the coals with a small, soft sound. A thread of smoke rises, pale against the cave's darkness, drifting upward toward the crack in the ceiling and out into the night air. Then this last watcher leans back against the stone, pulls their skins closer around their shoulders, and lets their eyes close. The cave breathes, the fire breathes, the sleeping people breathe. Outside, the stars continue their slow, patient movement through the enormous dark, and the valley is still, and the night is deep and quiet. And everything that matters in this moment, everything that constitutes a life fully and completely lived, is here, in this cave, around this fire, in the warmth of these sleeping bodies and the slow pulse of these breathing coals and the ancient, enduring stone that holds all of it gently as it has always held it, and will hold it still, long after the fire has gone cold and the people have moved on and the valley has changed beyond recognition. The stone will hold the memory. The stone always holds the memory. Sleep now. Thanks for listening.